Good evening. Major incidents have been declared across the UK as emergency services battle with the aftermath of Storm Dennis. Helicopters and rescue boats have been brought in to evacuate people trapped by the rapidly rising waters. At its peak this afternoon, a record number of flood warnings were in place for England. In Wales, more than a month's worth of rain fell in 48 hours. That's where our reporter Sejal Karia is. She sent this from Pontypridd in the south.
It was declared a major incident, and here in South Wales, it felt like it. In Crickhowell in the Brecon Beacons, emergency teams in a helicopter had to rescue a man waist-deep in water who was trapped in his caravan. His rescuer gaining access through a window before airlifting him to safety. And this is what he left behind. His town submerged in water and cut off, in the worst flooding to hit Crickhowell in 40 years. 30 miles away in Treforest, it was boats and firefighters coming to the aid of this elderly couple and their dogs after the River Taff burst its banks and overwhelmed their home and those of their neighbours. This time-lapse footage of the Usk shows how quickly river levels rose in just 24 hours, reaching heights not seen in decades. The heavy rain was also causing multiple dramatic landslides, like this one tearing down the side of a mountain.
The sofas were floating.
In Pontypridd, it was the water in homes causing misery and extensive damage. People using buckets and bins to remove the unwanted deluge from their doors. Paula Williams saw water rise to a metre in her newly refurbished living room, and even her kitchen appliances were overcome.
We've gone through all different emotions over the last 24 hours, well, less than 24 hours. It's hard to believe it. It's such a short space of time. Yeah, we've had the crying, we've had the laughter, and now we're just on autopilot now.
She's now begun the clean-up operation after river levels receded this afternoon. But while weather conditions have eased in South Wales this evening, the misery for many continues.
But the damage from the storm hasn't just affected Wales. Parts of Worcestershire and Herefordshire have also been given major incident status, and many warnings remain in place. In England, the number of flood alerts and warnings rose to an all-time high this evening, with 618 being put in place across the country. A short time ago, that had fallen to 602. But 4 severe flood warnings remain in place, meaning a continued risk to life, all on the River Team. Well, Stacey Foster reports from Tenbury Wells on the banks of the Team.
The streets of Tenbury Wells have been flooded before, but not like this for almost 13 years. There's no way into the town centre. The only way out is by rescue boat.
I'm really amazed of this thing. I'm really surprised what is happening right now.
Even those living up high are worried. Martin Craddock is weighing up whether to leave his flat or to stay.
We're all right till sort of probably tomorrow, and then we'll have to just make a decision on what we're going to do. So
the flood defences in front of the shops on the high street have been overwhelmed by the sheer amount of water, and as levels in the river continue to rise tonight, residents are saying this is starting to remind them of 2007.
Much of England has also seen widespread flooding. Huge areas of Yorkshire countryside that were already saturated because of rain, now completely swamped. And in York, businesses were preparing for things to get worse. In Brighton, the storm hampered the search for a woman who'd gone missing near the beach. Meanwhile, in the Scottish borders, last night emergency services were busy. 2 people had to be rescued from this car when a river burst its bank, sweeping the vehicle off the road. People evacuated from their homes took refuge in a local health centre overnight.
It started cuping in the front door, then the back door, and then coming up under the floor, so we had to abandon ship then.
Severe flood warnings remain in place on the River Team in Worcestershire tonight, which means there is a threat to life. And with a record number of flood warnings across the country, a week on from Storm Ciara, communities still await the full impact of Storm Dennis. Stacey Foster, ITV News.
So Storm Dennis has caused damage in London through strong winds, and in the home counties, heavy rain has caused areas of flooding. It may not have been on a scale to affect everyone, but its impact has been widely felt, as Paul Murphy-Casp can tell us.
Mole Valley in Surrey. It's usually surrounded by fields. Instead, it's been submerged by floodwater from the River Mole. Those blue flood defences were put up just yesterday to protect homes in Leatherhead. One of them is where Brenda lives, and the downpours haven't stopped since last night.
It's continued to rain here in Leatherhead all day, probably all night as well last night. And you can see I'm standing in front of my property, and this is how close I am to the river.
Elsewhere, strong winds and rain have caused disruption. A tree came down onto this London-bound southeastern train this morning.
It's cracked a couple of windows. There's a bit of a loud bang when it hit. We were wondering what it was. Yeah, we're all okay. Everybody's fine. There was British Transport Police on the train anyway, so we've all been kept safe. They've been very informative.
In South London, trees came down and even affected tram services for a while. The force of the winds meant the Dartford Bridge had to close at one point as well. And London's airports didn't escape either.
Oh my God, look at it!
Sports fixtures were postponed, including some of London's women's FA Cup games. And this is the Hertfordshire baseball team's home field. Thankfully, they didn't have a game today. While the worst of the rain has now passed, there are still flood alerts in place, along with the fears that the flood defences in Leatherhead might not survive the night. Paul Murphy-Casp, BBC London.